Hi, I'm Adam, and welcome once again to South Wales Ghost Watch. And on my show, I've got regular guest Martin with me here.
Hi.
And today we're going to be talking about mythology. Now, Martin, can you explain to me what a myth is?
A myth is an attempt to explain why things happen, how things happen, and what we can do about the things that have happened. A myth is something that explains the unexplainable. It's an attempt to make a psychological, social, cultural understanding of why bad things, good things happen, why we go through patterns of relationships that we do. It talks about being born, living and dying. It's a thing that is, I suppose, very prominent in the way we explain the world before science. Now, when I say that, I don't mean to explain or say that science is superior to mythology. Science is an alternative explanation to mythology. Both work, both help people make sense of the world. And what I'd like to sort of bring across is there was a very distinguished anthropologist called Claude Levi-Strauss, who was born in 1908, died only 5 years ago. And he was interested in how people made sense of the world. He thought that the tribesman living in the middle of the Amazon analyses and relates to the world in exactly the same way as the city stockbroker. It's just the terms they use. Strauss wrote a book which was falsely translated as The Savage Mind, but what it should really be called is The Untamed Mind. And what he was arguing in that book is that we all have tools of analysis, we all have methods of coping, and that there is not a lot of difference between the way a rational, inverted commas, scientist thinks of the world and a tribal shaman or witch doctor. And Levi-Strauss, in his long life, put together a detailed study of mythology. One of the tragedies that we have in this country is that we find it very difficult to understand that modern religious belief can be a mythology. I mean, I know people who think the world is only 6,000 years old, that evolution never happened, and that there is a day of judgment and a literal devil. I'm afraid that's a mythology. I can't prove there isn't any of... Well, I think I can prove evolution exists, and I can prove that the world is not 6,000 years old.
Yeah.
But I can't prove there is no devil. I can't prove there is or is not a God. All we can do is look at ways of trying to understand those things.
Okay.
And that's what mythology is concerned with.
Right, okay. I understand that legends are based on fact, but myths aren't really true, is that right?
Well, that's a very interesting thing. I don't know what you mean by true, Adam. True is a very interesting word. If enough people believe an event has happened, then it is true to the extent that they respond as if it's true.
Yeah.
You and I can't prove that atoms, protons, neutrons, electrons exist. We read them in a science book, which tells us those things.
Yeah.
I dare say that the scientific method is very different to certain mythological ways of thinking, but it bases on the same amount that somebody who is experienced in a particular way of looking at the world and is in a powerful position in that society makes a comment on how the world works, and people are educated to follow that way. And so that's how it is seen to be true. Now, a myth and a legend, that's an interesting one. Perhaps mythology is the whole study of all these Norse, Greek, North American Indian, Hindu, Eskimo, Inuit, all sorts of beliefs like that. But a legend has the sense of a more immediate society, not as long as a myth. A legend, like we might talk about legendary football players, legendary rugby players. We all have legendary events that have happened in our lives. So a legend is a particular cultural, a particular subset of mythology that exists in a particular place or time. I suppose you could talk about how legends grow up. I mean, one of the things that irritates me most is this strange belief that started by, I better not mention him, a certain former BBC sports presenter, who is into the idea that the world is controlled by shape-shifting lizards.
Who was that then?
I can't really, well, I better not comment on that, but I'm sure you could work it out. He also alleges that members of the royal family are lizards, and that all the politicians are lizards, and that the leading organisers of large multinational companies are lizards. I do believe that may be true with the multinational companies, but I don't think they look particularly lizardly. I think they just behave in that way. Now this legend has crept in, so you come across it in all sorts of things. In my psychological practice, I get people worked up about this sort of thing. I had people last year worked up about this idea about the Mayan calendar, the world was going to come to an end.
Yes.
But these are all approaches. A legend is something that develops out of an attempt to interpret, but is specific to a particular time. There is a species of legend called urban legends. These are legends that are told things like, there was a story I heard recently that some years ago, somebody left their little toddler outside a store in Port Talbot, and when they came out the child had gone. The legend said that the child was then found, head shaved, change of clothes, about to be taken out. Now that story I have traced to about 60 to 80 origins throughout the world. In America we have the case of the Mormon missionaries who wander around for eternity. It's probably very similar to the old medieval legend of the wandering Jew who allegedly denied Christ. The story of the guy who picks up this beautiful girl on the way back, and he drops her off at a house, and he goes back, and her mother says, "I'm sorry, she died 5 years ago." The alligators in the New York sewer, once more based on the idea that there are alligators down there. Apparently in the 1920s, they found two very emaciated little crocodiles down there, and the whole legend started from there.
Oh, okay.
So we have to treat these cultural stories. I mean, I heard one that a few years ago a horse was found up in Davati Flats, that it had been taken up there and it had grown up there, you know. So you get all these sorts of stories that these urban legends are usually used to either denigrate or promote a particular place, person or situation. So legends are more specific. They may in their end feed into mythology, but one of the things we always have to be aware of is to look at the mythologies we live by and the legends that influence us. And then, if we critique them and look at these things, we become more understanding of ourselves.
Okay, all right. So what is comparative mythology then?
Comparative mythology is taking, this was Claude Lévi-Strauss's work largely, but it does go back further than that. Comparative mythology is taking, say, Norse, Greek, Roman, Egyptian, Russian mythology, Hindu mythology, and trying to compare it. And what we seem to identify is a number of themes emerge in comparative mythology. There's what we call the trickster figure. The trickster figure is a character that plays jokes on everybody. You know? In Norse mythology, this figure is Loki. In Egyptian mythology, the figure is Set. In Christian mythology, the figure is the devil. In Roman mythology, Mercury plays a lot of tricks. So you've got this theme of trickery. I mean, there was an episode where we had a trickster in a supernatural episode on the series. So the idea of the trickster is there to test, to challenge, to make humans better than themselves.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So if you think of an example like, let's take an example of Christian mythology. And I says, I don't wish to offend anybody, but Christianity has been in power for 2,000 years. It's made all religions other than itself a mythology, and I'm afraid now it's beginning to face up to itself being a mythology. The devil in Western culture is often known as Satan. Now, what that effectively comes from is a confusion between Shaitan, who is the Hebrew, the Jewish overlord of the underworld, and Lucifer, the light bringer. Yeah, and the figure of the devil, seems to be promoted at certain times. The devil is not the serpent in the Garden of Eden who tempted people.
Yeah.
The devil is a character that appears at times when society feels threatened and they want to oppress certain sorts of people. So the devil is largely emphasised from St. Augustine after 400 AD. Early Christianity is not there. And if you think of the story of Job in the Bible, the story is that Yahweh, the Old Testament God, says to the devil, my servant Job is a true and worthy individual. I want you to go and test him for his belief. And the implication there is that the devil, or whatever, is acting on the word of God. Now, you move forward through history and you get the idea of, in the New Testament, Jesus is taken and tempted by Satan in a similar sort of way. But it's as if he is still doing that role. The confusion that we get is we mix up the serpent, we mix Lucifer, we mix Satan, we mix that strange schizophrenic book put in at the end of the Bible called the Book of Revelations for the Antichrist, and all this sort of stuff as well.
Yeah.
And these are all different figures. In northern England, if people are playing tricksters, they're still often called a real Loki, yeah, using the idea of the trickster god in as somebody who is challenging and testing people. You get the same character. I can't remember the name. I think it's Lizard Man. I think in nothing to do with that earlier theory I mentioned. Where they test. So you've got a figure like that. You've also got a very powerful healing god. You'll have like Asclepius in Greek myth. You'll have Hermes in Roman. You'll have characters who come and teach wisdom to humans and help them heal, because that healing aspect is very important. In Egyptian mythology, you've got that similar sort of theme. I think it's Thoth who is healer. These occur across all religions, all beliefs, all sorts of things. You also get a very erotically powered woman like Aphrodite or Isis or whatever. And the strange uniqueness about modern Christianity is it doesn't have that role of promoting a positive sexuality. It's a religion that has largely pushed down the views of women and denied sexuality. So you've got all these themes that work through. And of course, we have the old god Pan, who most gentlemen would like to be like him, as shall we say, he's always ready for sexual action. You get a similar sort of character in Egyptian myth. These are what we call chthonic deities. They're in touch with procreation, fertility, passion. Yeah, I'm afraid we don't have anything like that in modern Christianity either. In fact, in the big three monotheisms, we don't get very much like that at all. Though to be correct, there is an early legend in Judaism that Adam had the first wife called Lilith. Now Lilith wanted to be equal to Adam. In fact, it's rather colourfully said that Lilith wanted to be on top when they had sex. And Adam wasn't very much into this, though I can't think why. As a result, he complained to God that Lilith was too demanding. So he said, could you make me a more docile one, please?
Yes.
Now that's a legend that exists. Now that's about the only of the big three religions. I mean, Judaism isn't really a monotheism, but you know, it's there. So all these themes exist right across mythology. And what we have to get used to is look at modern beliefs in a mythological sense. To some people that will be very offensive, and I'm sure 400 years ago I'd now be burnt at the stake. But I think the important thing is that we have to learn that our beliefs can never be proved, and that mythology is a means of looking at these themes. Good old Carl Jung called them archetypes, but I'm sure we'll get on to him later.
We will, very, very much so. So do you think myths have transmitted well and inspired TV and film audiences over the years?
Myths evolve and develop.
Yeah.
Let's think of the situation. Let's take an example of a myth that has influenced. Let's take the Star Wars myth. Yeah. There we have a rogue. Yeah.
Yeah.
Harrison Ford character. Yeah. We have the wise old man, Obi-Wan Kenobi. We have the brother and sister who do not know they are brother and sister.
Yeah.
Yeah. And we have the son who rescues the father from darkness. That's a sort of a mythological theme that exists right across. What fascinates me is the number of we talked about King Arthur some.
We did. I believe it was about 3 shows ago. Wasn't
3 or 4 shows
yeah,
ago, yeah. And there we have a case of a king, a betrayer, a wife who is unfaithful, yeah, and the search for a holy or sacred object. Think of how many versions of. There has been a recent version of Merlin. There have been Camelot. There have been all sorts of things like that. So mythological themes are continually being restated. The problem we have is we don't teach people this at school or ever to see these themes. So perhaps it's not so much that they transmit well, they transmit where they are needed and where there are things missing. Because we learn from myths how to behave in particular situations and particular approaches. So myths will always inspire films, and they will inspire it in different ways. You cannot suppress the older myths. They keep coming back. Carl Jung, who we'll talk about later, called it the return of the repressed.
Yeah, of course, you've got Clash of the Titans, you've got Thor as well.
Yes, of course you've got Thor, haven't you?
Yeah,
yes.
Thor.
Yes. Now, I mean, let's make a little mention of the Norse gods in particular. Right. The Norse gods are an interesting bunch. They're flawed. They're not perfect. A bit like the Greek gods, but the Norse gods are particularly flawed. They are traditionally part giant as well. They are flawed in nature, and they behave very much like we do as humans. Yeah.
Yeah.
There's a constant theme that they're into. Basically, they're into their love life. They're into feasting and drinking. They're into honouring themselves. And Norse mythology helps us understand our own imperfections. In Greek mythology, Zeus was always having extramarital relationships, and I don't think it's any accident that we will create and explain our behaviour in terms of their behaviour. The uniqueness of that sort of approach is that when early Christianity came along, the Romans thought that the Christians were atheists because they didn't have statues of their God. So to that sort of approach, they were being blasphemous. Okay. And a lot of the Roman authorities thought that they actually they were cannibals because they consumed the body and the blood.
Really? Oh,
yeah.
Gosh.
So when we look back at what we believe now, it's very difficult to take ourselves back into that sort of mind approach that they had then. So mythology is bound to reflect the strengths and weaknesses of a particular society and to explain how things are. Personally speaking, my own commitment and belief in life after life is I can't think of anything more boring than sitting in a heaven for eternity with no wine and interesting company. I think I prefer to keep coming back again and again and again till I've worked that through my system. The Buddha himself said we shouldn't speculate on what happens once we've achieved enlightenment because we can't know it now.
Well, who knows?
Yeah, precisely.
What could happen? Yeah. You mentioned Carl Jung earlier as well. You once quoted, "Myths are the expression of a culture or society's goals, fears, ambitions, and dreams."
Yeah, that's right.
So what did he mean by that?
What he meant was it explains why we aim at certain sorts of things, why we understand certain things, why we suffer as we do. Carl Jung's insight into the role of mythology is influenced by two things. First of all, he believed in something called the collective unconscious, which is a connection between all of us. We all share a collective unconscious that we draw stories from. Jung's interest in myths was because he listened to the stories of the psychotic and the what he was conventionally mad. And he found that the stories they told bore distinct resemblance to mythological ways of thinking. Now, I'm not saying that because you have a mythological way of thinking that you are mad. But what I'm trying to say is that when people suffer from a psychosis, Jung would have thought their individual personality has sunk back in or is more closer to the collective unconscious. And therefore they pick up more mythological information. Jung himself comes from an interesting background. His father was a Lutheran minister who we think had a faith crisis, and his mother was some form of medium. So Jung also had picked up information from there. He was also a great reader of mythological works, and as well, when he broke with Freud, we think he had a nervous breakdown for about 3 or 4 years, and during that time he experienced many strange things, many mythological dreams, and so Jung is wonderfully empowered to understand how mythologies work. I think that if we don't look at those mythologies, we miss so much about ourselves.
Okay, moving on. What can you tell me about different types of mythology? We've gone through Greek, Egypt, Roman, Nordic, Egyptian. We've pretty much covered that, haven't we?
Well, let's just look at a reason why there would be some differences.
Yeah.
Egyptian mythology is based on the idea of fertility and the gods and society responding well and behaving well. To the Egyptian mind, the Nile floods regularly, once a year, and depending on the width of the flood, the inundation, that is how land is created so that crops can be grown. It's a very regular pattern. And so to the ancient Egyptian mind, the world was about regularity, of honouring your place, of worshipping the order. In the Egyptian mind, there was fear of chaos and breakdown. And so you had to make sure that you did things in the proper traditional way. Egyptian society was a very conservative society, not in the modern sense of conservative, but in the sense that things were structured in very orderly ways. And if you think about it, Egyptian civilization basically functioned perfectly well for about 6,000 years, with each ruler who came in, who conquered Egypt, eventually becoming seen as a pharaoh.
Yeah.
If you think of Norse mythology, it's cold. The world is cold. It's going to end in a terrible winter. Yeah. The mythology reflects the age, the climate, the geographical factors of the particular society it finds itself in. If you think about Greek and Roman gods, well, the Greek gods in particular just lay around in the sun making love and drinking wine and feasting. I think I prefer that approach.
I think we all would, wouldn't we?
I think so.
Yeah, definitely. So what about mythological gods like Zeus, Apollo, Jason, Achilles? Well, what can you tell me about them?
Well, Achilles and Jason were heroes. There is a crossover between gods, humans, and demi-humans whose parents are gods or goddesses. Once more, that's an attempt to explain great heroism, great achievement, people who go on epic voyages, people who discover things. It helps explain why people are driven, why they have a destiny. The legend of Prometheus stole fire from the gods and gave it to humans, and so he was punished. You understand why suffering occurs. All these sorts of approaches. The belief about human life being unusual is that all humans face up to the prospect of their death. And in a sense, the gods are jealous of that in lots of myths, because although dying is a bit inconvenient,
Well, we try not to think about it though, don't we? Let's be
we
fair.
try not to think about it in various societies.
Yeah,
so what we do is we thereby have a certain sweetness that is given to those odd moments. Yeah. Now, if you live for eternity with eternal consciousness, then that's a bit different. Of course, as I said, we keep coming back, but we experience different things in different times.
Yeah.
And there is an old belief that the initial creator or creatrix of the world wanted to experience many things and broke itself into many parts so that it too would experience these things. So, that old tradition. There's a very interesting science fiction writer called Michael Moorcock, who was a player. He played in the band Hawkwind, and he wrote a lot of books in the 60s and the 70s talking about how the gods were created by man, but we created the gods we needed, and that the gods themselves were effectively batteries of power that represented collective ideas of human energy. It's an interesting sort of theory.
Yes.
And of course the Egyptian idea is that in the end we are evolving towards becoming gods ourselves.
Okay.
Which is an interesting idea. The uniquely Christian idea that we are broken worms lying on the ground, full of sin and guilt and depravity, doesn't really do a lot for our progress to move forward.
No.
If we actually recognise that we have within us, after millions and millions and millions of progressions, that possibility of being creators ourselves, that's pretty exciting.
Oh yes, definitely.
Though I don't think, I think that's many millions of lives to go.
Yes, well, a long way off yet. So what is it about mythology that inspired you yourself?
My father read mythology to me from when I was 4. I liked myths. I liked hearing about alternative ways, and I used to create absolute havoc by challenging the vicar that my grandmother used to take me to church every day, every Sunday. I used to think, well, hang on, that's very similar. I remember reading The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe.
I love that book.
And seeing in it the image of Aslan,
Yeah.
who was died upon the stone table, and the White Witch is another variant of the betrayer and betrayed of Christ and Judas, of Enkidu and Ereshkigal in Babylonian myth. And the more I read myth, the more fascinated I become by it. I think myths help us explain many things, and I think we should respect them. And I think at different times of our lives we go through mythological patterns.
Yes.
Of becoming a young man, middle-aged, older, so on. And I have noticed in relationships, people tend to take mythological patterns in relationships.
Yes, yeah.
As well. They fulfil certain roles. So mythology is a comparative psychology as well, that if we look at and respect, it will take us a long way.
Okay, well, thanks very much for coming on the
Thank
show,
you.
Martin. You've explained that brilliantly, and it's a learning curve for us all. You know, we're all learning with each show, really. But that's all we got time for tonight, guys. But
Thank
thanks
you.
for tuning in.
And may your mythologist be with you.
Yes, that's right. But tune in next week, where we're going to be discussing Apocalypse, World's End, and Judgment Day. Okay.
Wow.
Very interesting. Take care.